They called him a failure. Too small, too timid, and too soft for the brutal world of police work, Scout was the weakest German shepherd of his litter, a dog who froze when the world got loud. But high in the frozen peaks of the Cascade Mountains, when a decorated Army Ranger was left hanging upside down from a cliffside tree, beaten and abandoned to the winter's mercy, this rejected dog would do what no trained canine could. The veteran was Sergeant Mason Hale, and he was minutes from becoming another ghost in the snow. What this weak dog did next would shatter every expert's opinion and make time itself seem to freeze. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story of redemption touches your heart, please subscribe to witness more incredible bonds. Winter had settled over the Cascades like a heavy, white silence, turning the peaks into a jagged labyrinth where the only law was survival. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The mountains did not care about medals or rank. In the high wilderness of Washington state, the wind moved like a blade through the pines, and the ice formed a solemn, frozen audience to the secrets of the dead. It was here that Sergeant Mason Hale had come to disappear. At 34, he carried the posture of a man who was still braced for an explosion that had already happened. He was lean and scarred, his forest green eyes harboring the perpetual vigilance of a soldier who had seen the world break, and he moved with a pronounced limp, a jagged reminder of the shrapnel that had ended his career and his peace. Mason wore his isolation like armor. As a survival instructor, he led others through the brush, but he lived in an internal fortress where no one was allowed entry. He was broken equipment, or so he told himself during the long whiskey-soaked nights in his cabin. To the world, he was a hero. To himself, he was the man who had come home while his younger brother, Danny, had stayed behind in the dirt of a foreign ridge. The survivor's guilt was a shadow that grew longer with every mountain sunset. He preferred the company of trees because they were honest. A blizzard didn't pretend to be a friend, and a mountain didn't offer a hollow, "Thank you for your service." He understood the brutality of the Cascades better than the noise of the city. His colleagues saw a man of terrifying efficiency and unbearable silence. A man who never stood with his back to a window and who volunteered for the most dangerous winter patrols just to keep his mind from dreaming. But the mountain was preparing a test that Mason's ranger training couldn't solve. It was a test of what happens when two failures, a man who thinks he's lost his soul and a dog the world deemed too weak to lead, are forced into a final stand against a merciless enemy. The storm was coming, and the ghosts Mason had been running from were about to become very real. The smell of the K-9 training facility in northern Idaho was a pungent cocktail of burlap, dried blood, and high-octane adrenaline. It was a place where excellence was measured in the crushing force of a jaw and the unshakable drive to hunt. For Scout, it was a place of 1,000 small deaths. He stood in the dust of the training arena, an 18-month-old German shepherd who looked more like a yearling than a champion. His littermates were broad-chested machines of muscle and instinct, but Scout was different. He was lean, almost delicate by comparison, with one ear that refused to stand fully upright, a perpetual flop that gave him an air of uncertainty in a world that demanded absolute conviction. "Drive him. Bring him in," the head trainer, a man named Vance whose voice sounded like gravel being ground under a boot, barked from the sidelines. The decoy, a massive man encased in a thick black bite suit, began to agitate. He swung a padded stick, shouting, creating a wall of sound and controlled aggression designed to trigger the predatory switch in a working dog's brain. Scout's handler, a young man who still believed in the pup's champion bloodline, felt the leash go slack. He nudged Scout forward, whispering a command that should have sent the dog launching like a kinetic projectile. Instead, Scout lowered his center of gravity. He didn't growl, he didn't show teeth. His intelligent amber eyes weren't filled with the red mist of the hunt, but with a profound, vibrating anxiety. He looked at the man in the suit not as a target, but as a person in distress, or perhaps, a monster he wasn't equipped to fight. Then came the proof. Vance raised a starter pistol and fired a blank into the air. The crack of the shot echoed off the corrugated metal walls. For a police dog, that sound should have been a starting gun, a signal that the stakes had been raised. But for Scout, the world simply shattered. He didn't tuck tail and run. That would have been a different kind of failure. He simply froze. He became a statue of fur and bone, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard it was visible through his chest. He stayed there, paralyzed by the sensory overload, while the decoy laughed and Vance spat a glob of tobacco into the dirt. "He's a ghost," Vance said, walking over to the handler. He's got no bottom, no grit. You're wasting your time in my floor space. He's the weakest shepherd I've seen come through this program in 10 years. A dog that freezes under fire is a liability that gets officers killed. Pack his gear. He's done. The rejection was total. Scout was stripped of his working vest, his pedigree relegated to a footnote of shame. Because he was a washout with a high-profile bloodline, the facility didn't want him around to dilute the brand. He was sold cheaply to an elderly couple, the Hendersons, who lived on the edge of a quiet town. For 4 months, Scout lived a life he finally understood. There were no guns, no bite suits, and no gravel-voiced men. There was only the smell of lavender, the slow creak of a rocking chair, and the gentle hand of Mrs. Henderson, who saw his softness as a virtue. She called him a sensitive soul, a dog who could feel the weather changing before the clouds arrived. But the world has a way of finding those who seek peace and breaking them anyway. The accident happened on a Tuesday. A patch of black ice, a heavy logging truck, and a momentary lapse in physics. Scout had been in the back seat, his head resting on the upholstery. The violence of the impact was a blur of shrieking metal and the smell of gasoline. He had been thrown from the vehicle as it rolled into a ravine. When he crawled back to the wreckage, the gentle hands were still, and the world was silent again. He stayed by the car for 2 days until animal control arrived. They didn't see a sensitive soul. They saw a traumatized, behaviorally stunted washout from a K-9 program. In the holding pen, he overheard the hushed conversations of the shelter staff. He's from the Von Draken line? Look at him, he's tiny. And the bite report from the academy says he's a freezer. No one's going to adopt a broken working dog with trauma. If we can't move him in 48 hours, we'll have to clear the kennel. The word euthanize wasn't spoken, but Scout felt the weight of it in the air. He knew the smell of death. It was the same smell that had lingered in the ravine. When the transport van door wasn't latched properly during a transfer to a high-kill facility, Scout didn't hesitate. He didn't run out of malice. He ran out of the sheer desperate need to exist. He vanished into the jagged shadows of the Cascade Mountains, a domestic ghost returning to a wild he was never meant to survive. For 2 months, the weakest dog lived on the edge of starvation. He learned to hunt field mice by the sound of their hearts beneath the snow. He learned that his small size was a blessing. He could fit into rock crevices where the wolves couldn't follow. He survived not by being the strongest, but by being the most invisible. One evening, a mountain lion had tracked him to a ledge. Scout had been cornered, the massive cat a tawny shadow of certain death. In that moment, the old freeze response threatened to take him. But as the lion lunged, Scout's smaller, nimbler frame allowed him to drop into a narrow fissure in the granite, a space too tight for the predator. He waited there for 10 hours, listening to the cat's frustrated claws scraping the stone. He was small. He was timid. He was weak. But he was alive. 50 miles away, Sergeant Mason Hale was discovering that survival was a far more miserable fate than death. The morning air in the Cascades was 30 degrees, but Mason was sweating as he stood before a group of 6 corporate executives who had paid $5,000 each to experience the wild. Mason loathed them. He loathed their brand-new Gore-Tex jackets that had never seen a speck of real dirt, and he loathed the way they looked at the mountains as if the landscape were a theme park designed for their personal growth. He stood before them, his posture a study in rigid, military discipline. He was 34, but the gray at his temples made him look 50. His face was a map of hard miles, a sharp jawline, eyes the color of a cold forest, and a scar that ran from his temple to his ear. He leaned heavily on his left leg, his right leg slightly turned out. Navigation isn't about looking at a screen, Mason said, his voice flat and devoid of the instructor charm the agency had asked him to use. It's about knowing where you are in relation to the things that can kill you. If you lose your bearings in these mountains, the terrain doesn't give you a second chance. It just waits for you to stop moving. He held up a compass, his fingers steady, but his mind was drifting. He looked at the topographic map spread out on the hood of his truck, and suddenly the contour lines began to shift. The green of the Cascades bled into the dusty tan of a ridgeline in the Kunar province. He wasn't looking at a corporate hiking trail. He was looking at Objective Delta. Mason, I can't see the North Star, a voice whispered in his mind. It was Danny, his younger brother. Danny had been 22, a kid who still had a zest for life that Mason had already traded for a Ranger tab. Mason had been the one to teach Danny how to navigate. He had been the one who told him that as long as you can find the high ground, you can find your way home. I've got the high ground, Mace. I'm okay, Danny had radioed 10 minutes before the mountainside exploded in a symphony of RPG fire and belt-fed machine guns. "Hey, instructor? You okay?" one of the executives asked, snapping Mason back to the present. Mason blinked, his jaw tightening. "I'm fine. We're moving. 5-mile trek to the base of the ridge. If you can't keep up, stay by the truck. I'm not hauling anyone out." He turned and began to hike, his limp more pronounced on the uneven ground. Every step was a grind of bone on metal, the legacy of the shrapnel that had shredded his thigh while he was trying to drag Danny's body toward the extraction bird. He had survived. Danny hadn't. That was the math Mason lived with every day, and the numbers never added up in his favor. The afternoon was a disaster of incompetence. The group was slow, complaining about the thin air and the cold. Then it happened. One of the men, a high achiever, named Miller, who wanted to prove he was the alpha of the group, decided to test the emergency equipment without permission. He pulled a flare gun from the survival kit Mason had left on a rock while checking a trail marker. Thwack boom. The flare ignited with a sudden, violent crack. The red phosphorus hissed as it streaked into the gray sky. To the executives, it was a cool visual. To Mason Hale, it was the end of the world. The sound of the launch was the exact frequency of an incoming mortar round. Before the red light had even reached its apex, Mason's body reacted with a speed that bypassed his conscious mind. He didn't think, he evaporated. He hit the frozen dirt with a bone-jarring thud, his hands covering his head, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. "Get down. Contact front. Contact front," he roared, his voice a guttural scream of pure, unadulterated terror. He scrambled on his belly, ignoring the agony in his leg, trying to find cover behind a fallen log. He was back in the dust. He could smell the cordite. He could hear the screaming of the men he couldn't save. He was clawing at the dirt, his eyes wide and vacant, seeing ghosts in the treeline. The executives stood there in stunned silence, watching their tough instructor have a total breakdown in the middle of a peaceful forest. Miller held the empty flare gun, looking embarrassed and confused. "Sergeant Hale?" "It was just a flare, man," Miller said, his voice tentative. Mason stayed in the dirt for a long minute, the silence of the woods slowly filtering back in. He realized where he was. He saw the expensive jackets. He saw the pity and the fear on their faces. He stood up slowly, brushing the pine needles from his chest, his face turning a deep, humiliated red. "Class is over," Mason said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "But we paid for her." "I said it's over." Mason snapped, his eyes flashing with a violence that made Miller take 3 steps back. "Get back to the truck." "No. I'm calling the agency. You'll get a refund. Just get out of my sight." He didn't wait for them. He hiked back alone, his limp so severe he had to use his rifle as a cane. By the time he reached his cabin, the sun was dipping below the peaks, casting long, jagged shadows that looked like grasping fingers. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat at his small kitchen table, the only sound the ticking of a clock and the rhythmic clink of a whiskey bottle against a glass. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of dog tags. They were bent, the metal scarred by fire. Hale, Daniel R. Mason ran his thumb over the letters until his skin was raw. The phone on the counter rang. He knew who it was. Dr. Aris, the VA counselor who called every Thursday like clockwork. Mason watched the phone vibrate, the light from the screen illuminating a pile of unopened mail and a bottle of high-strength painkillers. "Pick up, Mason," he whispered to himself. "Tell her you're fine. Tell her you hit the dirt because of a flare gun and made a fool of yourself in front of a bunch of pencil pushers." He didn't pick up. He let it go to voicemail. He drank the whiskey in one swallow, the burn in his throat the only thing that made him feel alive. He looked at himself in the darkened window, a man who had been a ranger, a leader, a brother. Now he was just a ghost who taught people how to start fires they would never need. He was broken equipment, discarded by the army and unsuitable for the world of the living. He was a failure in every measurable way. The next morning, the pain in his leg was a dull, throbbing ache that felt like a hot wire wrapped around his femur. He went through his routine with mechanical precision. 2 pills for the leg. Black coffee, bitter and hot. A perimeter check of his small plot of land. He moved like a soldier in a war zone, checking the shadows, listening for the snap of a twig. He trusted no one. He didn't want connection. He wanted a bunker. Just as he was finishing his coffee, his radio crackled to life. It was the head ranger from the station 5 miles down the mountain. "Mason? You there?" "Go for Hale," he said, his voice raspy from the whiskey and the silence. "Listen, I know you had a rough go with that group yesterday, but I need a favor. We've had reports of some unusual activity up near the North Basin, near the old logging route. Some hikers saw men with tactical gear and snowmobiles. It's federal land, but we think they might be using the trail markers to navigate a drug route from the border. I need someone with eyes like yours to go up there and check the markers. It's remote and the weather is turning. Most of the guys are tied up with a search and rescue down in the valley. Mason looked out the window. The sky was a bruised purple, the clouds heavy with the promise of a blizzard. The North Basin was a death trap in a storm, cliff-heavy, avalanche-prone, and miles from any help. It's dangerous, Mason. Maybe too dangerous for a solo patrol with that leg of yours, the ranger added. If you want to pass, I get it. Mason looked at the dog tags on the table. He looked at the whiskey bottle. He thought about the way he had hit the dirt yesterday, the way the world looked at him like he was a ticking bomb. He felt a strange, cold pull in his chest, a desire to be where the world was at its most honest. I'll do it, Mason said. What have I got to lose? He packed his gear with the precision of a man preparing for a final mission. He checked his GPS, his thermal layers, and his heavy-duty rope. He didn't know that 40 miles away, a small, weak German shepherd was currently scenting the air, feeling the same storm approaching. He didn't know that their lives, both discarded and deemed worthless by the world of the strong, were about to collide on a frozen cliff where strength would have to be redefined. As Mason stepped out of his cabin and into the biting wind, he didn't see the shadow moving through the trees on the far ridge. He didn't see the men who were already waiting for him, men who had no intention of letting a broken soldier interfere with their business. And high above, the first flakes of snow began to fall, beginning to erase the world and set the stage for a meeting that would rewrite both their destinies. The mountain was waiting. The rope was ready. And as Mason began his ascent into the white abyss, a low, guttural growl echoed from a nearby crevice, a sound that wasn't a threat, but a warning of something far worse than the cold. The air at 6,000 feet didn't just carry the cold, it owned it. It was a physical weight, a thin, crystalline presence that burned the back of Sergeant Mason Hale's throat with every drawing breath. He hiked with a rhythmic, grinding cadence, the heavy tread of his left boot followed by the softer, hitch drag of his right. Each step was a negotiation between his willpower and the jagged remains of his femoral artery and bone. The forest here, deep within the North Basin of the Cascades, was a cathedral of ancient hemlock and Douglas fir, their branches so thick with accumulated snow they looked like the bowed heads of giants in prayer. Mason didn't look at the beauty. He looked at the shadows. He looked at the way the light fractured through the canopy, searching for the unnatural, the straight line of a rifle barrel, the dull matte of a thermal optic, the slight shimmer of disturbed frost. He was a man out of time, a ghost of the Rangers walking through a world that had moved on from his kind of violence, yet he could not turn off the internal radar that had kept him alive while better men fell. His limp was his metronome. Step drag. Step drag. The pain was a dull, white-hot hum in his hip, a constant companion that reminded him he was no longer the apex predator he had once been. He carried a heavy rucksack, the weight centered to help his balance, and a weathered M70 Scout rifle slung across his back, more for the occasional mountain lion or injured elk than for people. Or so he told himself. In reality, the weight of the steel against his spine was the only thing that kept the creeping dread of the open air from swallowing him whole. He reached the first trail marker near the logging route, a weathered wooden post with a faded, "No motorized vehicles" sign. It was tilted, the wood splintered. Mason knelt, his bad knee popping with a sound like a dry branch breaking. He ignored the flare of agony, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the ground. The snow was not right. To a casual hiker, the white expanse would have looked pristine, perhaps ruffled by the wind. But Mason saw the story written in the powder. There were depressions, deep, oval-shaped ruts that hadn't been made by the wind. They were snowmobile tracks, high-output engines by the look of the tread width. And beside them there were boot prints. He leaned closer, his breath blooming in a silver cloud. He didn't just see tracks, he saw a formation. 3 men. They were walking in a staggered file, their strides synchronized. The weight distribution in the prints suggested they were carrying heavy loads, not camping gear but something dense, something metal. The Vibram soles were fresh, the lug patterns crisp. These weren't the boots of weekend warriors from Seattle. These were tactical boots, the kind used by private contractors or specialized units. His heart, which had been beating at a steady mountain-climbing pace, suddenly shifted gears. It was a familiar sensation, the cold, electric hum of adrenaline as it flooded a system that had been dormant for too long. His broken leg didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. The ghost of Danny seemed to whisper in the wind, a warning he'd heard 1,000 times in the valleys of Afghanistan. Watch your flanks, Maze. The shadows are moving. He should have turned back. His orders were to check the markers and report back via radio from the high ridge where the signal was strongest. But the isolation that had been his prison now became his catalyst. He had spent months waiting for his life to mean something again, or for it to simply end. This trail offered a third option, a purpose. He began to follow the tracks, moving off the main trail and into the dense undergrowth. He moved with a predatory grace that defied his injury, stepping on rocks and exposed roots to mask his own prints. He was a shadow moving through a world of white. The tracks led him deeper into the basin, toward a hidden amphitheater of rock known as the Devil's Throat, a clearing surrounded by sheer granite walls and a single narrow exit. As he neared the edge of the clearing, the silence of the mountain was violated. It wasn't the wind or the snap of a branch, but the low mechanical thrum of a generator and the sharp rhythmic clack-clack of metal cases being stacked. Mason dropped to his belly, crawling through the freezing powder until he reached a lichen-covered outcropping that overlooked the clearing. He pulled a pair of compact binoculars from his chest rig, his hands steady despite the biting cold. What he saw made the hair on his neck stand up. The clearing was a staging ground. 2 high-powered mountain snowmobiles sat idling, their exhausts huffing gray smoke into the air. A dozen heavy, Pelican-style cases were stacked near a makeshift lean-to. But it was the men that held his attention. There were 4 of them, all dressed in high-end winter camouflage, carrying short-barreled carbines with suppressors. They moved with a practiced, military efficiency that set them apart from common criminals. In the center of the clearing stood a man who didn't need a uniform to command authority. He was tall, with a barrel chest and a face that looked like it had been hammered out of iron. He wore a black tactical parka and a chamois wrapped around his neck, a veteran's habit. He was directing the loading of the snowmobiles with short, sharp hand signals. Mason recognized the posture. He recognized the way the man checked his surroundings, his head on a swivel. This was Carlos Mendez. Mason didn't know his name yet, but he knew his soul. He was the dark mirror, the soldier who had taken his skills and turned them inward toward the rot. Mason reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He had no signal, but the camera still worked. He began to take photos, his thumb clicking the shutter with mechanical precision. He captured the faces, the crates, the serial numbers on the snowmobiles. He was the witness now. He was the one piece of broken equipment that could dismantle this entire operation. Focus, Mason, he told himself. Get the evidence. Get to the ridge. Call it in. He began to back away, his chest heaving with the effort of staying low. His bad leg was screaming now, the cold-induced cramps turning his muscles into knots of iron. He needed to clear the ridge before the storm hit, or he'd be trapped in the basin with 4 hunters who knew exactly how to find him. He reached a thick stand of pine, 30 yards from the clearing. He shifted his weight to turn, his right foot searching for a solid anchor in the snow. Zirarak. The sound was small, a single dry branch hidden beneath the powder. In the stillness of the mountain, it sounded like a gunshot. Mason froze. He didn't breathe. He didn't move a muscle. In the clearing, the generator seemed to fade into the background. Carlos Mendez stopped mid-sentence. His head snapped toward the tree-line, his eyes locking onto the exact area where Mason was crouched. He didn't shout. He didn't panic. He simply raised his carbine and made a low whistling sound. "We got company," one of the men shouted. "Spread out. Flank the ridge." Mendez's voice was a gravelly roar, commanding and cold. Mason didn't wait. The time for stealth was over. He surged to his feet, a guttural groan escaping his lips as his bad leg protested the sudden, violent movement. He turned and began to run, not the fluid, effortless sprint of his youth, but a desperate, lurching gallop. Step drag. Step drag. Behind him, he heard the roar of a snowmobile engine turning over. The sound was a predator's growl, gaining ground with terrifying speed. Stop him. Don't let him reach the ridge. Mason scrambled up a steep embankment, his fingers clawing at the frozen earth. He could hear the crack of a suppressed rifle, a soft pft, and the bark of a tree inches from his head exploded in a spray of splinters. They weren't firing warning shots. He reached into his pocket, his fingers fumbling for his radio, but he knew it was useless. He was in the shadow of the mountain, a dead zone where signals went to die. His only hope was the cliffside trail 2 miles ahead. It was treacherous, a narrow shelf of rock that overlooked a 300-foot drop into the gorge. No snowmobile could follow him there. But as he crested the first rise, he realized he had underestimated them. The sound of snowmobiles wasn't just behind him, it was to his left. They were using the logging road to cut him off. They knew the mountain. They had mapped the terrain. Mason was being herded, pushed toward the very cliff he thought was his salvation. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth. His vision began to tunnel, the white of the snow blurring into a dizzying smear. He was a ranger. He was a survivor. He would not die in the dirt like this. He reached the cliff's edge, the wind howling up from the gorge like a choir of the damned. The trail here was barely 2 feet wide, a ribbon of ice and stone clinging to the side of the mountain. He looked back. Mendez and 2 of his men were 50 yards away, their snowmobiles discarded as they moved forward on foot. They moved in a professional wedge, their weapons leveled. Mason reached the center of the narrow trail, a place where the granite wall bulged outward, creating a natural choke point. He unslung his M70, his hands shaking as he chambered around. This was the high ground. This was where he would make his stand. "That's far enough, Ranger," Mendez shouted, his voice carrying over the wind. He stopped 20 yards away, his men flanking him. He lowered his weapon slightly, his eyes scanning Mason with a professional curiosity. "You're a long way from the station, old man," Mendez said, a cruel smile touching his lips. "And that leg, you're lucky you made it this far. You've got that look about you. The 1,000-yard stare. You Army? Rangers? Maybe SEALs." Mason stood his ground, his rifle centered on Mendez's chest. "I'm a ranger. Federal land. You're done here. I got the photos. I've got the coordinates. My team is already moving." Mendez laughed, a dry, hollow sound that was swallowed by the gorge. "Your team? Don't lie to a liar, hermano. We've been monitoring the frequencies. You're alone. You're the guy they send to check the signs because nobody wants to deal with the head case veteran. You're the disposed. The broken equipment." Mendez took a step forward, his posture relaxed, almost predatory. "I was Army once. 10th Mountain. Then they decided I didn't fit the image. A dishonorable discharge for doing what needed to be done. There's no honor among the disposed, Mason. Only survival." Mason's finger tightened on the trigger. The wind gusted, nearly knocking him off his feet. He felt the isolation of the mountain pressing in on him. He had spent months wanting to be alone, and now that isolation was a noose around his neck. "You think you're the only one who knows this mountain?" Mendez asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "We didn't just find this route. We own it. And you're just a witness who stayed too long." Mendez looked at the sky, where the gray clouds were finally beginning to release their heavy burden of snow. "The storm is here, Ranger. No radio signal is getting out of this basin for the next 48 hours. We made sure of that. By the time the snow stops, you'll just be another missing hiker the mountain claimed." Mendez raised his hand, and the 2 men beside him leveled their carbines. "Wait," Mendez said, his eyes glinting with a sudden, dark inspiration. "Don't waste the lead. I want to see if a ranger can still fly." Mason looked at the 300-foot drop behind him. He looked at the men closing in. He was a soldier with an empty radio and a broken leg, standing on the edge of the world. He realized with a terrifying clarity that his wish for the mountain to take him was about to come true, but not on his terms. As the first heavy flakes of the blizzard began to blind him, Mendez took a final lunging step forward, and Mason realized that the weakness he had carried for so long was about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. But as he braced for the impact, a sound drifted up from the rocks below, a sharp, desperate bark that didn't sound like a wolf, but like something that had been waiting for him in the dark. The blizzard didn't just arrive, it claimed the mountain with the sudden, violent authority of an invading army. One moment, the peaks were jagged silhouettes against a bruised sky. The next, the world was a swirling, white madness that erased the horizon and turned the air into a thick slurry of ice. On the narrow shelf of the Devil's Throat, the wind howled with a predatory pitch, a sound like 1,000 starving wolves. Sergeant Mason Hale stood in the center of the whiteout, his back to a 300-foot drop that promised nothing but the cold embrace of the gorge below. He held his M70 Scout rifle with the practiced, steady grip of a man who had lived his life behind a trigger, but inside, the clock was ticking. He counted them, not just the 3 in front of him but the soft crunch of boots in the snow behind him. 2 more. 5 in total. The math was simple, and in the high wilderness the math usually ended in a burial. Mendez stood at the apex of the wedge, his face half obscured by his shamak, his eyes cold and clinical. He wasn't rushing. He knew the terrain and he knew his prey. He saw the way Mason's right leg trembled, the way the ranger shifted his weight to keep from collapsing. "You're a ghost, Mason," Mendez called out, his voice cutting through the gale. "And ghosts don't belong on the mountain. They belong in the ground. Then come put me there, Mason rasped. The first man moved, a thick-set henchman with a scar across his bridge. He lunged with the overconfidence of a man who thought a limp made a soldier helpless. Mason didn't fire. He couldn't risk the muzzle flash blinding him in the wideout. Instead, he swung the butt of the M70 in a short, brutal arc. The walnut stock connected with the man's jaw with a sickening crack, sending a spray of blood and teeth into the snow. As the man fell, Mason used the momentum to pivot, his bad leg screaming in protest. He felt the second attacker before he saw him. He dropped his center of gravity, ignoring the white-hot agony in his thigh, and drove his elbow back into the man's solar plexus. It was a ranger's dance, economical, violent, and precise. For a fleeting second, the broken equipment was working. The muscle memory of a decade of combat took over, erasing the pain and the doubt. He was no longer a hermit in a cabin. He was a weapon. He stripped the sidearm from the second man's holster in a blur of motion, leveling it at the third attacker. But as he went to plant his right foot to stabilize his aim, the mountain betrayed him. His right leg, the one held together by titanium pins and survivor's guilt, simply ceased to exist. The nerve endings, fried by the cold and the sudden exertion, went dark. There was no snap, no warning. The limb just buckled like a wet cardboard box. Mason went down. The world tilted as his knee hit the frozen granite. In that split second of vulnerability, the remaining three men were on him. A heavy tactical boot slammed into his ribs, the air escaping his lungs in a ragged wheeze. He tried to raise the pistol, but a rifle descended like a hammer, catching him square on the temple. The world exploded into a galaxy of white sparks. Enough! Mendez shouted. Mason felt himself being dragged. His face plowed through the biting snow, the grit of the mountain skinning his cheeks. He tried to fight, his hands clawing at the ice, but he was a passenger in his own body now. His vision was swimming, the gray sky and the white ground merging into a sickening soup. They threw him down near the base of an ancient, gnarled pine tree that clung to the very edge of the abyss. The tree was a survivor of a century of storms, its trunk twisted and scarred, its largest branch extending out over the void like a gallows. Mason coughed, a metallic tang of blood filling his mouth. He looked up, his vision doubling. He saw 5 pairs of boots. He felt a heavy hand grab his hair and yank his head back. "Look at you," Mendez hissed, leaning down until his breath was hot against Mason's ear. "The great ranger. The hero. Dying in the dirt because your body gave up on you. Just like your country did. Just like your team did. Just finish it," Mason managed to choke out. One of the men pulled a suppressed Glock from his hip. "I'll do it. Quick and clean." Mendez held up a hand. "No. No bullets. We're in a national forest and even with the storm, sound travels. Besides, a bullet is too good for a man who's already spent his life waiting for one. If we leave a body with a hole in it, it's a federal investigation. If he just disappears into the winter, he's just another statistic. Another veteran who couldn't handle the silence." The men looked at each other. The blizzard was intensifying, the wind now a constant, deafening roar. "What then, boss?" Mendez looked at the tree, then at the 300-foot drop into the darkness of the gorge. A cruel, slow smile spread across his face. "El Despenadero. The cliff drop. It's an old way. The mountain takes what it wants and we just provide the opportunity." He gestured to the heavy climbing rope Mason had been carrying in his own rucksack. "Tie his ankles. Double wrap them. I want him to feel every second of the blood rushing to his head." Mason tried to kick, but his legs were leaden. He felt the coarse nylon of the rope biting into his skin, cinching tight around his boots and ankles. They were efficient. They worked with the cold-blooded grace of butchers. "Heave," Mendez commanded. Mason felt the world invert. He was hoisted upward, the ground falling away. His stomach lurched as he was swung out over the edge of the cliff. The rope creaked as it was looped over the heavy pine branch. For a moment, he dangled in the open air, the wind buffeting him like a rag doll. Below him, there was nothing but a churning cauldron of snow and shadow, 300 feet of empty space ending in jagged river rocks. They tied the other end of the rope to the base of the tree, securing it with a series of heavy knots. Mason hung there, suspended between the sky and the grave. The blood began to pool in his skull, a heavy, throbbing pressure that made his eyes feel like they were going to burst. The cold, which had been a stinging annoyance, now began to seep into his core with a terrifying lethality. Hanging upside down accelerated the process. The heart struggling to pump against gravity, the extremities quickly losing the war for warmth. Mendez walked to the very edge of the ledge, looking down at Mason. He reached out and kicked the rope, making Mason swing out over the void. "The mountain will take care of you now, Ranger," Mendez said, his voice strangely calm. "Maybe the rope breaks. Maybe the cold gets you first. Or maybe when the sun comes up the eagles will find you. Either way you're finally where you belong. Caught between two worlds and welcome in neither." Mason looked up, or down, he couldn't tell anymore. Through the haze of pain and the rushing blood, he saw Mendez's face receding. "Give it 3 hours," Mendez told his men. "He'll be gone. Then we clear the cache and move the rest of the product. The storm will cover our tracks." The sound of their footsteps faded, replaced by the rhythmic, mournful creak of the rope against the pine bark. Creak, creak. It was the sound of a ticking clock. Mason was alone. The blizzard screamed around him, a white shroud wrapping him in a lethal embrace. His fingers were already numb, his breath coming in shallow, ragged puffs of silver. The pressure in his head was immense, a rhythmic pounding that synced with the throb of his injured leg. He closed his eyes and the darkness didn't stay dark. He saw a ridge. He saw the dust. He saw a boy with bright eyes and a smile that hadn't been earned in a war zone. "Mace? Why are we upside down?" "Danny," Mason whispered, the word cracking on his lips. "You told me the high ground was the only place to be, brother. You're pretty high up now." Mason hung there, suspended between the sky and the grave. The blood began to pool in his skull, a heavy, throbbing pressure that made his eyes feel like they were going to burst. The cold, which had been a stinging annoyance, now began to seep into his core with a terrifying lethality. Hanging upside down accelerated the process. The heart struggling to pump against gravity, the extremities quickly losing the war for warmth. Mendez walked to the very edge of the ledge, looking down at Mason. He reached out and kicked the rope, making Mason swing out over the void. "The mountain will take care of you now, Ranger," Mendez said, his voice strangely calm. "Maybe the rope breaks. Maybe the cold gets you first. Or maybe when the sun comes up the eagles will find you. Either way you're finally where you belong. Caught between two worlds and welcome in neither." Mason looked up, or down, he couldn't tell anymore. Through the haze of pain and the rushing blood, he saw Mendez's face receding. "Give it 3 hours," Mendez told his men. "He'll be gone. Then we clear the cache and move the rest of the product. The storm will cover our tracks." The sound of their footsteps faded, replaced by the rhythmic, mournful creak of the rope against the pine bark. Creak, creak. It was the sound of a ticking clock. Mason was alone. The blizzard screamed around him, a white shroud wrapping him in a lethal embrace. His fingers were already numb, his breath coming in shallow, ragged puffs of silver. The pressure in his head was immense, a rhythmic pounding that synced with the throb of his injured leg. He closed his eyes and the darkness didn't stay dark. He saw a ridge. He saw the dust. He saw a boy with bright eyes and a smile that hadn't been earned in a war zone. "Mace? Why are we upside down?" "Danny," Mason whispered, the word cracking on his lips. "You told me the high ground was the only place to be, brother. You're pretty high up now." Danny was sitting on the branch above him, swinging his legs. He looked exactly as he had the day they left for the Cunner, young, hopeful, and entirely unaware of the hole he would leave in the world. "I'm sorry," Mason wheezed, a hot tear freezing instantly on his cheek. I couldn't pull you back." "It's okay, Mace. I've been waiting. It's quiet here. No more mortars. No more flares. Just the snow." Mason felt a strange, seductive warmth beginning to spread through his chest. The mountain's mercy, the final stage of hypothermia where the body gives up the ghost and feels a false heat before the end. He felt the tension leaving his muscles. He looked at the abyss below and for the first time in 3 years he wasn't afraid. He was tired. So incredibly tired of being broken equipment. "I'm coming, Danny," he whispered. Finally. The rope creaked. The wind roared. Mason Hale, Sergeant Army Rangers, let his eyes flutter shut. He was ready for the silence. He was ready to let the mountain have what was left of him. But as his consciousness began to fray at the edges, a sound pierced the veil of the storm. It wasn't the wind and it wasn't the ghost of his brother. It was a sharp, high-pitched yelp, a sound of frustration and desperate intent. Something small and tan was standing on the edge of the ledge, looking down at him with amber eyes that held more than just instinct. Mason's eyes opened a sliver. He saw a flop-eared shadow against the white. "Go away." Mason groaned, his voice barely a vibration. But the dog didn't go away. Instead, it looked at the thick nylon rope tied to the tree, then at the man hanging over the void. The weakest dog, the one who had spent its life freezing in the face of fear, took a step toward the edge, its paws slipping on the ice. It looked at the branch. It looked at the man. And then, it did something no expert in a K-9 Academy would have ever predicted. As the first strands of the rope began to fray against the jagged bark of the pine, a low guttural growl started in the dog's chest. A sound not of fear but of a decision being made. Can a dog that was labeled too soft find the strength to do what no human could? And what will happen when the rope finally gives way to the mountain's weight? The world was a blurring tunnel of white and gray, and Scout was failing. His lungs were 2 sacks of burning glass, his heart a frantic bird trapped in the cage of his ribs, hammering with a rhythm that screamed one word: run. He was a small dog, nearly 20 pounds lighter than the breed standard for a male German Shepherd, and that lack of mass meant he lacked the long-strided power needed to outrun a nightmare in deep powder. Behind him, the mountain lion was a tawny ghost in the blizzard, a silent, heavy-muscled inevitability that didn't need to hurry. It knew the dog was flagging. It knew the weakest of the litter was finally reaching the end of his endurance. Each time Scout's paws broke through the crust of the snow, the effort to pull himself free cost him precious seconds. His internal monologue was a chaotic mess of old traumas: the sound of the starter pistol at the academy, the look of disappointment in Vance's eyes, the cold silence of the shelter. He was a freezer. When the pressure reached a certain threshold, his brain simply opted out. He had survived the last 2 months in the Cascades by being invisible, by hiding in the cracks of the world where predators didn't think to look. But today the blizzard had driven the big cats to desperation, and Scout had been caught in the open. He reached a ridge where the wind whipped with such ferocity it nearly knocked him sideways. His vision was clouded by ice clinging to his whiskers, his one flopped ear heavy with slush. He was searching for a crevice, a hole, anything to disappear into. He veered toward a jagged outcropping of granite, his legs trembling so violently he could barely keep his chest from dragging. And then the air changed. The scent hit him like a physical blow, cutting through the ozone smell of the storm and the musky, ancient odor of the stalking cat. It was the smell of salt, of gun oil, of worn leather, and something else: the metallic copper tang of fresh blood and the sour, acrid stench of human fear. Scout skidded to a halt, his claws scraping against the icy stone. His training, the deep-seated instincts that had been beaten into him and then discarded as useless, flared to life. Human. Distress. He forgot the lion for a heartbeat, his head swiveling toward the edge of the cliff. He crept forward, his belly low to the ground. He reached the base of a gnarled, ancient pine that leaned precariously over the gorge, its roots clutching the rock like the knuckles of a dying man. Scout looked over the edge and the world seemed to tilt. Hanging from a thick nylon rope, swaying like a pendulum in the freezing gale, was a man. To Scout, the figure wasn't Sergeant Mason Hale, the decorated ranger. He was simply the source. He was the smell of the Hendersons' living room, the smell of the men who had once tried to teach Scout how to be a hero, and the smell of a life that was currently leaking out into the white abyss. Scout's immediate response was the one he had practiced his whole life. He froze. The sight of the man hanging upside down, his face a mask of purple bruised skin and frozen blood, was too much. It was a sensory overload that triggered the old academy paralysis. Scout's legs locked. His tail tucked tight against his belly. Every fiber of his being told him to turn and run back into the trees, to let the mountain have this broken thing, just as the world had tried to have him. A low, guttural rumble vibrated through the ground beneath his paws. Scout turned. The mountain lion had reached the ledge. It was 30 feet away, crouched low, its yellow eyes glowing with a hungry, predatory light. It ignored the man hanging from the tree. The man was a heavy, static thing. The dog was the prize, warm, soft, and exhausted. Scout was trapped between 2 deaths. Behind him, the void and the dying man. In front of him, the apex predator of the Cascades. His breathing came in ragged, sobbing huffs. He looked at the lion and then he looked back at the man. In that moment, Mason Hale groaned. It wasn't a cry for help. It was the sound of a man who had already accepted his end, a soft, pathetic wheeze of air that signaled the final surrender. Scout watched the man's hand. The fingers were blue, curled like dead leaves. Something shifted. It wasn't a sudden explosion of courage. It was a quiet, stubborn refusal. Scout looked at the man and didn't see a master or a soldier. He saw someone who was discarded. He saw someone who was being told by the world that he wasn't enough, that he was broken equipment, meant to be left in the cold. Scout knew that feeling. He lived in it every day. For the first time in his life, when the fire went off, Scout didn't freeze. He stepped forward, his hackles rising in a jagged line down his narrow spine. He planted his small paws in the ice, his chest expanding. He opened his mouth, and instead of the high-pitched yelp of a frightened pup, he unleashed a bark that was raw, deep, and filled with a desperate, territorial rage. It was a sound that shouldn't have come from a 60-pound washout. The mountain lion paused, its ears twitching. It wasn't used to its prey talking back. It took a tentative step forward, baring its teeth. Scout didn't retreat. He moved to the center of the ledge, positioning his small body directly between the lion and the base of the tree where the rope was anchored. He was trembling, his legs were literally vibrating with terror, but he stayed. He was the weakest dog standing guard over a man who had forgotten how to fight for himself. The standoff lasted an eternity in the heartbeat of the storm. The lion assessed the dog's posture. It saw the desperation in Scout's eyes, the willingness to die on this patch of rock. Predators are economists. They don't like to risk injury for a small meal when the weather is this bad. With a final, frustrated hiss that sounded like steam escaping a pipe, the mountain lion turned its head, looked at the swirling white abyss, and vanished back into the treeline. Scout didn't celebrate. He collapsed for a second, his legs finally giving out, but the sound of the rope creaking against the pine branch brought him back. He crawled toward the edge, sniffing at the anchor point. The man was still there, swaying more violently now as the wind picked up. Scout leaned over the edge and sniffed Mason's wrist, which was dangling near a shelf of rock. He felt the faintest, most microscopic throb of a pulse. Help! Mason's voice was a ghost of a sound, barely audible over the roar of the blizzard. Scout whined. He couldn't pull the man up. He didn't have the weight or the leverage. He looked at the rope, thick, braided nylon that was cinched around the gnarled branch 10 feet above the ledge. If the rope stayed, the man died of the cold. If the rope broke, the man fell. But if the man stayed where he was a dead man either way. Scout looked at the tree. His small size had always been his shame, but as he looked at the narrow, ice-slick trunk of the ancient pine, he realized it was his only advantage. A 90-pound K9 could never have climbed this. But Scout was light. He was nimble. He made his first attempt, leaping for the lowest branch. His paws slipped on the glazed bark and he fell back into the snow with a yelp of pain. He shook himself, his amber eyes fixed on the rope. Failure. Too small. Too weak. The words of the trainers echoed in his ears. He tried again. This time he used his claws to dig into the deep fissures of the bark, scrambling upward with a frantic, scratching energy. He reached the first branch, his breath coming in sharp whistles. He climbed higher, moving like a cat rather than a dog, his heart rate redlining. He reached the limb where the rope was looped. He crawled out onto the branch, the wood groaning under even his meager weight. Below him, the man hung over the 300-foot drop. Scout reached the knot. He didn't have tools. He only had the one thing the academy said he lacked: drive. He began to gnaw. The nylon was bitter, tasting of chemicals and grit. It was designed to hold thousands of pounds, and Scout's jaw was small. He chewed with a rhythmic, desperate intensity. His gums began to bleed as the coarse fibers sawed against his mouth. Each time the wind gusted, the branch swayed, and Scout had to bury his claws into the wood to keep from being pitched into the void himself. 10 minutes passed. 20. The first strand of the outer sheath snapped with a sharp pop. Scout was encouraged. He didn't feel the cold anymore. He only felt the vibration of the rope. He was a dog who had been told he was too soft-hearted for the work. Now that heart was the only thing keeping him on the branch. He worked his way deeper into the core of the rope, his jaw aching, his saliva freezing into icicles on his chest. Mason Hale stirred below, his head lolling. "Danny, is that you?" Scout ignored the hallucinations of the dying man. He gave one final, violent tug, his neck muscles straining. Snap. The rope didn't just break, it detonated. The sudden release of tension sent Scout tumbling backward onto the trunk of the tree. Below, Mason Hale fell. Scout let out a sharp yelp of alarm, scrambling down the tree with reckless speed, his paws sliding, his fur tearing on the bark. He reached the ledge and looked down. Mason hadn't fallen into the gorge. The rope had been long enough, and the wind had pushed him just enough, that he crashed into a massive 10-foot-deep drift of soft powder that had accumulated on a secondary shelf of rock 20 feet below the primary ledge. Scout didn't hesitate. He launched himself off the cliff, disappearing into the white. He landed in the soft snow, tunneling through it until he found the man. Mason was buried up to his chest, his body limp, his face as white as the landscape. He wasn't moving. Scout began to dig frantically, his paws throwing plumes of snow into the air. He cleared the man's face, licking the ice from Mason's eyelids, barking directly into his ear. Get up, Scout's bark seemed to say. I didn't do all that just for you to sleep. Mason's eyes fluttered. He looked up, and through the haze of near death he didn't see a ghost or a brother. He saw a small, bedraggled German shepherd with one flop ear and a mouth stained with blood and nylon fibers. You, Mason whispered, his breath a faint puff of silver. He couldn't move. The cold had settled into his marrow. Scout realized the man was fading again. The dog didn't have a blanket and he couldn't build a fire. So he did the only thing a soft-hearted failure could do. Scout crawled into the hole in the snow. He pressed his warm, vibrating body directly against Mason's chest, tucking his head under the man's chin. He shared his heartbeat. He shared the heat he had generated from his climb and his fight. In the heart of the blizzard, on a ledge that didn't exist on most maps, the two most broken creatures in the Cascades became a single point of warmth. Scout stayed awake, his amber eyes watching the tree lean, his ears swiveling to catch the sound of the wind. He had done the impossible. He had found a purpose that was bigger than his fear. But as the night deepened and the storm began to scream with a new, icy fury, Scout heard a sound that made his fur stand on end. It wasn't the mountain lion and it wasn't the wind. It was the distant, mechanical whine of snowmobiles returning to the cliff to check on their handiwork. The hunters are coming back to confirm the death sentence, but they don't know that the weakest dog is standing guard. Can Mason wake up in time to fight, or has Scout's rescue only delayed the inevitable? The transition from the void back into the world of the living was not a gentle awakening. It was a violent collision with reality. For Sergeant Mason Hale, consciousness arrived as a scream of nerve endings, a cacophony of agony that felt like his blood had been replaced with shards of glass. His head throbbed with a rhythmic, heavy pressure, the result of the hours spent suspended upside down, and for a terrifying moment, his vision remained a blur of fractured light and obsidian shadows. He tried to draw a breath, but his lungs felt frozen, the air so cold it burned like lye. He was no longer hanging. The sensation of gravity was heavy and absolute, pinning him into a cocoon of snow that was both freezing and strangely insulating. He felt a weight on his chest, a rhythmic, vibrating heat that didn't belong to the mountain. He blinked, the ice on his eyelashes cracking, and found himself staring into a pair of amber eyes. They were wide, intelligent, and brimming with a desperate, singular focus. You, Mason croaked. His voice was a dry rattle, his throat constricted by the cold. Where did you come from? Scout didn't bark. He let out a soft, high-pitched whine, his tail thumping once against the packed snow. The dog's muzzle was stained with a dark, frozen residue. Mason realized with a jolt of clarity that the dog's gums were bleeding. He looked up at the gnarled pine branch looming 20 feet above them, the frayed remnants of a nylon rope dancing like a ghost in the gale. The weakest dog had chewed through a mountain-grade rope. He had fought the mountain and won. Mason tried to shift, but the movement sent a lightning bolt of pain through his right thigh. His ribs, already cracked from the beating, felt like they were being crushed by an invisible vice. He groaned, his head falling back into the snow. The mountain's mercy, the seductive, lethal warmth of hypothermia, was trying to pull him back under. He could feel it in the tips of his fingers, a numbing peace that promised an end to the grinding guilt and the physical wreckage of his life. Don't you dare, Maze, Danny's voice whispered in the back of his mind. The dog didn't bleed for you just so you could take a nap. Mason gritted his teeth, his jaw locking with a sudden, fierce resolve. He reached out with a hand that felt like a block of wood, burying his fingers in Scout's thick, tan fur. The dog leaned into him, offering his strength without hesitation. Okay, Mason whispered. Okay, buddy. Help me up. The process of standing was an exercise in pure, unadulterated torture. Mason rolled onto his side, his breath coming in ragged, white plumes. He used his left arm to anchor himself against a rock and signaled to Scout. The dog moved instinctively, sliding his narrow shoulder under Mason's armpit, bracing his 60-pound frame with a rigidity that defied his small stature. Mason heaved himself upward. He felt the dog's muscles straining, his paws sliding in the powder as he fought to keep the 200-pound ranger from collapsing back into the drift. Mason's bad leg gave out twice, the limb a useless weight, but Scout didn't budge. He stayed planted, a living crutch that refused to break. You're too small for this, boy, Mason panted, his forehead resting against the dog's neck. You're too small, but God, you're stubborn. Scout let out a low huff, a sound of grim determination. They stood there for a long minute, a broken man and a rejected dog, silhouetted against the whiteout. Mason looked at his surroundings. He was a ranger, His mind began to process the topography even through the haze of a concussion. They were on a secondary shelf below the devil's throat. To stay here was to die. The shelf was an ice trap. To go back up was impossible. The only way was down, through the dense timber and into the drainage of the basin. "We need to move," Mason said, more to himself than the dog. "Shelter. We need shelter within the hour, or the engine's going to stop." He checked his wrist. His watch was cracked, but it still ticked. The light was failing. The winter sun was a pale, dying ember behind a curtain of gray. He looked at Scout, whose ears were swiveling, catching the nuances of the wind that Mason couldn't hear. "Lead the way, Scout. Find us a hole. You know this mountain, don't you?" Scout took the point. He didn't run. He moved with a measured, careful gait, constantly checking back to ensure Mason was still upright. They began the descent, an agonizing journey of inches and feet. Mason's navigation skills functioned on autopilot. He noted the moss on the leeward side of the trees, the way the snow drifted against the rocks, the subtle lean of the firs. But Scout seemed to have a different map, one drawn in scents and vibrations. The dog veered away from a deceptively flat clearing. Mason realized a second later it was a hidden sinkhole masked by fresh snow. The cold was a living thing now, a predator that followed them, nipping at their heels. Mason's core temperature was dropping. He could feel the shivering start, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that threatened to shake him apart. They passed a frozen waterfall, a towering curtain of blue-tinted ice that looked like a cathedral organ frozen in mid-crescendo. The sight triggered a memory sharp and vivid as a knife. "Look at the line, Maze. It's perfect." Danny had been 21, his face bright with the thrill of the climb. They were in the North Cascades, back before the war had changed the color of their dreams. Danny was lead climbing a vertical sheet of ice, his ice tools swinging with a rhythmic, joyous precision. He had looked down and laughed, a sound that the wind couldn't touch. "I'm gonna beat your time, big brother. The broken leg won't be an excuse today." Mason had laughed back then. He had felt invincible. He had felt like the mountain was their playground, not their tomb. He stumbled now, his bad leg catching on a submerged root. He went down hard, his shoulders slamming into a cedar trunk. He stayed there for a moment, the memory of Danny's laughter mixing with the howl of the blizzard until he couldn't tell the difference. "Had a brother once," Mason muttered, his voice slurring. Scout was instantly there, nudging his hand, licking the frost from his knuckles. "He was like you. Stubborn. Never knew when to quit." Scout whined, a sharp, insistent sound. The dog's ears perked, his head snapping toward a rock formation 50 yards to their right. He didn't just nudge Mason. He grabbed the sleeve of the ranger's jacket and pulled. It was a clear, directed signal. "I'm coming. I'm coming." The snow was now a whiteout, a laundry room of swirling ice that erased all depth perception. Mason was walking on faith and the tension of the dog's body. They reached a jagged wall of granite, a prehistoric outcrop that looked like the spine of the earth. Scout led him along the base, sniffing the cracks, until he stopped at a narrow opening shielded by a thicket of stunted hemlock. It was a shallow cave, more of a rock overhang than a cavern, but it was dry. The wind screeched past the entrance, but inside the air was still. Mason crawled into the shadows, his strength finally deserting him. He collapsed onto the cold stone, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Good boy," he whispered, his eyes closing. "Smart boy." Scout didn't wait for an invitation. He crawled in after him, circling once before flopping down and pressing his entire length against Mason's back. He tucked his nose into the crook of Mason's neck, his steady rhythmic breathing acting as a heater. Night fell over the Cascades, a deep, obsidian dark that felt heavy enough to crush the lungs. Outside, the blizzard reached its crescendo, the wind tearing branches from the trees and sending them crashing into the gorge. Inside the rock, Mason drifted in and out of a feverish delirium. He was back in the Cunner. He was in the dirt. He was watching the extraction bird lift off, seeing the empty seats where his men should have been. "They all died," Mason whispered into the dark, his voice cracking. "Danny? Halt. They all died and I lived. It's not fair, Scout. It's not fair." He felt a soft paw touch his hand. Scout was awake, his amber eyes reflecting the dim, ambient light of the snow. The dog whined, a low, mournful sound of empathy. "You're scared too, aren't you?" Mason asked, his hand fumbling to find the dog's head. "They told you that you weren't good enough. Too soft. Too timid. They told me I was a hero, but they treated me like a broken tool they couldn't figure out how to fix." He felt the dog's heart beating against his spine. It was a strong, steady thump, the heartbeat of a survivor. Maybe we're both exactly what we need, Mason murmured, the shivering finally beginning to subside. Two failures, keeping each other alive. Just two rejects on a mountain. A strange sense of peace settled over him. For the first time in months, the nightmares didn't come. He didn't see the fire or the blood. He only felt the warmth of the dog and the honest, brutal cold of the mountain. He slept, a deep, restorative sleep that he hadn't known since before the ambush. He woke to the sensation of a wet tongue on his cheek. The dawn was a pale, gray smear across the entrance of the cave. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world transformed. The forest was buried in 3 feet of fresh, crystalline powder, the branches of the pines bowing under the weight like white-robed monks. Okay, Mason groaned, his body stiff. Okay, buddy. Time to move. He felt better. Not whole but functional. The rest and the dog's warmth had pulled him back from the edge of the cliff. He checked his leg. It was swollen and purple, but it held his weight as he used a fallen branch as a makeshift crutch. They exited the cave, the air crisp and silent. But the silence didn't last. From the distance, drifting over the ridge from the direction of the Devil's Throat, came a sound that made Mason's blood run colder than the snow. It was a mechanical whine, the high-pitched staccato rasp of snowmobiles. 2 of them. Maybe 3. They're looking for my body, Mason whispered, his eyes narrowing. Mendez doesn't leave loose ends. He looked at Scout. The dog's timid posture was gone. He stood tall, his head held high, his ears forward. He looked at the ridge, then back at Mason. He wasn't waiting for a command. He was waiting for the hunt to begin. They think I'm dead, Scout. That's our only advantage. But we can't stay on the trails. They know the markers. Scout took a step toward a dense, seemingly impassable thicket of brambles and deep snow, a route that led away from the cabin but deeper into the uncharted ruggedness of the basin. The dog looked at him, his amber eyes bright with a natural tracking intelligence that no academy could have taught. You want to go that way? Mason asked. Scout let out a single, sharp bark, a sound of absolute conviction. Lead on, Scout, Mason said, gripping his branch. Let's show them what a couple of failures can do when they've got nothing left to lose. As they disappeared into the white labyrinth, the sound of the engines grew louder, and Mason realized with a jolt of adrenaline that the tracks they were leaving in the fresh snow were a map that led straight to their hearts. He needed to find a way to break the trail, or the mountain wouldn't be the thing that killed them, and Scout was already looking at a sheer ice bridge that looked like it would collapse under the weight of a bird. How will Mason cross the unstable ice bridge with a broken leg? And what is Scout sensing in the shadows that Mason has completely missed? The morning sun was a cold, indifferent eye peering through a haze of ice crystals, offering light but no warmth. As Sergeant Mason Hale moved downslope, the world became a study in agonizing slow motion. His right leg had progressed from a sharp, biting pain to a heavy, throbbing resentment that seemed to vibrate in time with his heartbeat. Each time he planted his makeshift crutch, a sturdy limb of mountain mahogany he'd found near the cave, the vibration traveled up his arm, rattling his teeth and stoking the fire in his hip. He was a man coming apart at the seams, held together by nothing more than the warmth of the small dog trotting at his flank and a stubborn, ranger-bred refusal to die in the shadows. Scout moved with a newfound fluidity, though his ears remained on a constant, nervous swivel. He was no longer the shrinking pup from the K-9 Academy. He was a scout in the truest sense, his nose working the wind for the scent of gasoline and old leather, his eyes scanning the ridgelines for the silhouette of a hunter. But even Scout's courage couldn't mask the physical reality of their situation. He was tired, his ribs showing through his tan coat, his paws tender from the ice. Yet every time Mason stumbled, the dog was there, a solid fur-covered anchor pressing against his side, offering a silent strength that Mason had begun to rely on more than his own. The descent led them toward the floor of the basin, where the timber thinned and the mountain opened up into a wide, windswept valley. And there, cutting through the white expanse like a jagged obsidian scar, was the river. In the height of summer, it was a babbling tributary of the Skykomish, a place for trout and clear water. Now it was a 40-foot wide gauntlet of treacherous, unstable ice. Mason stopped at the bank, leaning heavily on his branch, his breath rising in thick, silver clouds. He looked upstream and down. The banks were steep, choked with impenetrable deadfall and devil's club thorns. This was the only crossing point for miles, and the only way to reach the abandoned ranger cabin that Mason knew sat on the far side, tucked into a grove of ancient cedars. "I don't like it, Scout," Mason whispered, his voice sounding small against the vast, frozen silence. He stepped to the edge and tapped the ice with his crutch. The sound was wrong. Instead of the sharp, metallic tink of solid, black ice, it gave back a hollow, groaning thud. Recent snowmelt from a brief thermal inversion must have sent a surge of warmer water beneath the surface, hollowing out the ice from below. It was a rotten crossing, a shell of frozen white hiding a churning, lethal current. Scout let out a low, vibrating whine, his hackles rising. He paced the bank, his nose down. He could hear the water, the muffled, subterranean roar of the river fighting its icy cage. He looked at Mason, his amber eyes wide with a prehistoric fear of the deep. "I know, buddy," Mason said, his hand trembling as he reached out to steady himself on a nearby willow. "I know it's bad. But we go back, Mendez finds us. We stay here, the cold takes us. The only way is forward. We have to cross." Mason looked at the far shore. It looked like another planet, distant and unreachable. He looked at Scout, seeing the dog's hesitation. This was the moment where the freezer would usually opt out. This was the pressure that broke him at the academy. "We do this together, Scout. Do you hear me? Together." Mason took the first step. He didn't walk. He lowered himself onto the ice, distributing his weight as much as possible. He began to crawl on his belly, his bad leg dragging behind him like a dead weight. The ice immediately let out a long, shrieking crack that traveled from his hand all the way to the center of the river. He froze, his heart hammering against the ice. Scout stayed on the bank, his paws dancing on the verge. He was whimpering now, a high-pitched, frantic sound. The old trauma, the sound of the gun, the feeling of being overwhelmed by a task too big for his frame, was screaming in his blood. "Come on, Scout," Mason called, his voice gentle but firm. "I know you're scared. Look at me. I'm scared too. But I'm not leaving you and you're not leaving me. One step. Just one." Scout looked at Mason, then at the ice. He took a tentative step, his claws scratching for purchase. He was lighter than Mason, his weight spread across 4 points, and the ice held. He moved forward, his belly low, mimicking the man. They were 10 feet out. 20. The ice groaned and shifted, a living thing beneath them. Mason's shoulder was screaming, the effort of dragging himself across the textured surface taxing his last reserves of strength. He looked at Scout, who was now only a few feet away, his intelligent eyes fixed on Mason's face as if seeking a tether. "That's it, boy. Almost there. Just a little further." They reached the midpoint, the deepest part of the channel where the current was at its most violent. The ice here wasn't white, it was a translucent, sickly green. Suddenly, a sound like a gunshot echoed through the valley. Correct. A spiderweb of fractures erupted beneath Mason's chest, spreading with terrifying speed. "Run. Scout, run." Mason roared. But the command, the high-stress, shouted order, triggered the final, fatal circuit in Scout's brain. The dog froze. He didn't run for the shore. He locked his joints, his eyes glazing over, the freezer response taking total control. He was a statue on a collapsing stage. "Scout, move." The ice buckled. Mason saw the water rising through the cracks, a dark, freezing flood. He looked at the dog, and in that moment he didn't see a pet or a failure. He saw Danny. He saw his brother standing in the dust, frozen by the suddenness of an ambush, waiting for a command that would save his life. "Danny, move your ass." Mason's voice didn't come from his throat. It came from the deepest, most scarred part of his soul, the part that had been screaming at a ghost for 3 years. The name, or perhaps the sheer raw authority of the scream, broke the spell. Scout's eyes snapped back into focus. He lunged forward, his claws digging in, his small body propelled by a sudden burst of adrenaline. He leaped across a widening gap of black water, his hind legs scrambling for purchase on the solid shelf of the far shore. He made it. But the force of Scout's leap was the final straw for the ice beneath Mason. With a sickening, heavy groan, the entire section collapsed. Mason didn't even have time to shout. The world was suddenly black, silent, and impossibly cold. The shock of the water was a physical blow, a hammer of ice that stole the air from his lungs. The current was a physical hand, grabbing his rucksack and pulling him downstream away from the hole. He opened his eyes, but there was nothing but the green-black ceiling of the ice above him. He pounded on it with his fists, the sound muffled and pathetic. He was trapped in a coffin of water and light. His lungs began to burn, the biological demand for oxygen overriding his reason. He clawed at the underside of the ice, his fingernails tearing, his vision beginning to fade into a series of bright, dancing sparks. So this is it, he thought, a strange, watery calm settling over him. Not the rope. Not the bullet. Just the river. On the shore, Scout was frantic. He ran along the edge of the ice, his nose down, following the dark shadow of the man as it drifted beneath the surface. He could see Mason's face, a pale, distorted mask through the 3 inches of ice. This was the moment that had haunted Scout's lineage, the moment where the soft dog was supposed to turn and run, to find a warm place to hide and wait for the end. But the dog who had chewed through a nylon rope was gone. In his place was something forged in the cave, something that understood that survival was a shared burden. Scout saw a hairline fracture in the ice, a place where a fallen branch had created a weak point. He didn't hesitate. He didn't freeze. He launched himself onto the ice, his paws a blur of motion. He reached the fracture and began to dig. It wasn't the refined work of a search and rescue dog. It was a violent, primal assault. Scout used his teeth, his claws, his entire weight. He bit at the ice, his mouth filling with freezing slush and blood as the jagged edges tore at his gums. He was a 60-pound machine of desperation. Below, Mason saw the disturbance. He saw a flash of tan fur, a frantic movement above his head. He mustered his last ounce of strength and drove his fist upward toward the light. Scout's paws broke through. He didn't stop. He widened the hole, his claws raking the ice away until Mason's hand erupted from the water like a drowning man's prayer. Scout didn't bark. He lunged forward and grabbed the heavy fabric of Mason's jacket sleeve with his teeth. He braced his hind legs on the solid shelf, his small frame straining, his neck muscles bulging with an effort that should have been impossible. He pulled. He growled, a deep, guttural sound of pure, unyielding will. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, Mason's head broke the surface. He gasped, a ragged, choking sound as he sucked in the freezing air. With Scout's help, he managed to get his elbows onto the ice. The dog didn't let go. He kept pulling, his eyes fixed on Mason's, until the ranger had crawled completely out of the death trap and onto the snowy bank. Mason collapsed into the snow, his body shaking with such violence he could barely keep his teeth from shattering. He was hypothermic, his clothes already beginning to stiffen into a suit of armor. Scout stood over him, shaking the water from his own coat, his sides heaving. "You," Mason wheezed, his voice a thread of sound. "You didn't freeze. You saved me, Scout. You saved me." Scout let out a soft, tired whimper and nudged Mason's hand. The dog was exhausted, his paws bleeding, his mouth a mess of torn tissue. But he had done it. The coward had faced the abyss and pulled his partner back. "Can't stay here," Mason muttered. He knew the science of the cold. In these temperatures, he had less than 15 minutes before his core temperature dropped to the point of no return. His clothes were holding the water against his skin, acting as a heat sink. He needed to get dry and he needed to get warm or the river would still win. Scout seemed to understand the urgency. He began to pull at Mason's collar, leading him away from the riverbank and toward a dense grove of ancient cedars and pines. The trees were so thick that the ground beneath them was relatively dry, the canopy acting as a natural umbrella against the falling snow. Mason reached the grove and collapsed behind a massive, fallen log that provided a windbreak. His fingers were useless, white and wooden. He looked at Scout. "Help me, buddy." Mason began the grim, mechanical process of survival. With trembling hands, he stripped off his sodden jacket, his thermal layers, and his boots. He was naked in the winter air, his skin a ghastly, translucent blue. He used a dry corner of his rucksack to wring out what he could, his movements clumsy and slow. Scout didn't need to be told. As soon as Mason lay down on his dry rucksack, the dog crawled over him. Scout didn't just lie beside him. He draped himself across Mason's chest and abdomen, covering the vital organs. He was a living, breathing furnace, his high canine body temperature a gift from a god Mason hadn't believed in for years. Mason pulled his damp, wrung-out thermal top over both of them, creating a small, humid tent of shared heat. He felt the first tremors of the re-warming shock, a violent, racking shivering that made his bones ache. He wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in the wet, musky fur. "Too small," they said, Mason whispered, his voice finally beginning to steady. "But you're exactly big enough, Scout. You're exactly big enough." Minutes turned into an hour. The shivering slowly subsided, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. Mason felt the warmth returning to his limbs, the blood beginning to circulate again. He looked down at the dog. Scout was asleep, his head resting on Mason's shoulder, his breathing deep and rhythmic. For the first time since the ridge in Afghanistan, for the first time since he had watched the light go out in Danny's eyes, Mason Hale felt something other than guilt. He felt a strange, burgeoning warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the dog's body heat. He reached out and stroked Scout's flopped ear, a genuine, tired smile touching his lips. "Thank you, Scout," he whispered, "for not running away." It was a quiet moment of peace, a fragile sanctuary in the heart of the wilderness. But as Mason began to drift into a restorative sleep, the mountain reminded him that the game wasn't over. From the distance, carrying clearly over the frozen river and through the cedar grove, came the unmistakable high-pitched snarl of snowmobile engines. They were closer now, much closer. And this time there were more than two. Mason's smile vanished, his eyes turning back into the hard forest-green flint of a ranger. He reached for his rucksack, his fingers fumbling for the cold steel of his rifle. "They know we're alive, Scout," Mason said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "And they're hunting us. We've got to move. Now." But as he tried to stand, his bad leg didn't just throb, it gave a sickening, wet pop, and Mason realized the fall into the river had done more damage than he thought. He was on the far side of the river, but he was trapped in a grove with a pack of wolves closing in, and the only thing between him and Mendez was a dog who was currently staring at a shadow moving through the trees. Who is watching them from the darkness of the cedars? And can Mason fight a war on one leg when the ammunition is almost gone? The world had become a monochromatic blur of exhaustion and ice. For Sergeant Mason Hale, time no longer moved in minutes or hours, but in the agonizing inches gained through sugar snow, that treacherous, granular powder that offered no purchase and swallowed a man's strength with every lurching step. His right leg was no longer a limb, it was a heavy, throbbing anchor made of lead and broken glass. The titanium pins from his old life seemed to be vibrating against the bone, chilled by the pervasive cold that even his thermal layers could no longer keep at bay. Beside him, Scout was a shadow of his former self. The dog's tan-and-black coat was matted with ice, and his breath came in ragged, shallow huffs that froze instantly into silver whiskers. Yet, the dog moved with a rhythmic, mechanical persistence that shamed Mason into continuing. They were moving downslope from the river crossing, seeking the lower timberline where the canopy might offer some reprieve from the wind, but the mountain was not done testing them. The air was unnervingly still, a dead calm that usually preceded a shift in the mountain's mood. Scout stopped suddenly, his nose twitching, his one flopped ear snapping upright as far as the cartilage would allow. He didn't bark, he simply went rigid, a low, barely audible vibration starting in his chest. Mason dropped to one knee, his bad leg buckling under the weight of his rucksack. He followed Scout's gaze toward a ridgeline several hundred yards below them. Through the crystalline air, he saw them, three dark shapes cutting through the white expanse. Snowmobiles. They were moving in a coordinated search pattern, their high-output engines a distant, mechanical hornet hum that felt like a violation of the wilderness. Mason reached into his gear and pulled out his radio, the one he'd scavenged from the smuggler he'd tackled at the river. He kept the volume low, pressing it to his ear. Static hissed, then a voice broke through, cold and authoritative. "He couldn't have gotten far," Mendez's voice crackled, distorted but unmistakable. "The river would have finished him, but I want eyes on a body. No man crosses that basin with a leg like his and survives a night in the open. Find the ranger. Find the dog. If they're breathing, stop them. If they're not, take a picture for the records." Mason's grip on his rifle tightened. He looked at Scout, whose amber eyes were fixed on the machines below. The hunters were searching the lower valley, assuming Mason had taken the easiest path toward civilization. They didn't realize he had doubled back through the rock fields. "They don't know we're mobile, Scout," Mason whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "They think they're looking for a corpse. Let's give them something else to look at." A tactical spark, a remnant of his days leading ranger squads through the jagged peaks of the Hindu Kush, flickered to life in Mason's mind. He looked at the terrain. To their left was a massive, unstable slope, a classic avalanche chute known to the locals as the White Grave. The recent blizzard had piled feet of fresh slab over an older, slicker layer of crust. It was a ticking bomb waiting for a trigger. "It's a gamble, buddy," Mason said, looking at the dog. "A big one." He began to move toward the lip of the chute. Scout immediately balked. The dog's instincts were screaming. He sensed the instability of the snowpack, the way the mountain seemed to hold its breath. Scout sat back on his haunches, whining softly, refusing to follow the path toward the precipice. "I know, Scout. I know it's dangerous," Mason said, kneeling to look the dog in the eye. "But we can't outrun those machines on one leg. We need the mountain to do the fighting for us. It's the only way." Scout looked at the ridge, then back at the man who had shared his warmth in a cave. The dog's loyalty was a tangible thing, a tether that pulled him forward even as his primal fear urged him to flee. With a low, submissive huff, Scout stepped into Mason's tracks. Mason began to move along the very edge of the ridge, deliberately kicking large clumps of snow down the slope and leaving a deep, messy trail that even a blind man could follow from a distance. He was baiting the hook. He moved with a forced speed, his limp creating a distinct dragging pattern in the snow. Below, the engine noises shifted. The steady hum became a roar of acceleration. Got something. Fresh trail on the upper ridge. Looks like he's trying to head for the North Pass. Mason heard the snowmobiles turn, their skis biting into the slope as they began to climb. They were fast, faster than he had anticipated. The roar of the engines began to vibrate in his chest. He reached the center of the avalanche chute, a place where the snow felt unnervingly hollow beneath his boots. When I say run, you run straight down, Scout. Don't look back. Don't stop for me. You just run, Mason commanded. Scout was trembling, his tail tucked tight. The vibration of the approaching snowmobiles was triggering every freeze instinct in his body. He looked at the white wall above them, then at the machines breaking through the treeline 200 yards below. Mason reached into his emergency kit and pulled out the last flare. He looked at it for a second, the same tool that had sent him into a PTSD-fueled breakdown just 48 hours ago. This time there was no fear, only a cold, calculated necessity. Sorry, brother, he whispered, the memory of Danny flashing briefly in his mind. This is gonna be loud. He struck the igniter. Thwack boom. The red phosphorus streaked upward, a brilliant, bleeding wound against the gray sky. For a heartbeat, there was a deafening silence. The snowmobile stopped. The smugglers looked up, shielding their eyes from the glare. Nothing happened. The mountain remained still. Mason felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Did I miscalculate? Is it too stable? Then he felt it. A vibration not from an engine but from the earth itself. A deep, subaudible groan, like the cracking of an old bone. A single hairline fracture appeared 500 feet above them, spreading horizontally across the entire face of the slope. Run! Mason screamed. The world shattered. The white grave lived up to its name as the entire upper snowpack sheared off in a single massive slab. It didn't fall, it flowed, a churning white tsunami of thousands of tons of ice and debris. Mason pushed Scout forward. The dog bolted, his small size and light weight allowing him to skim over the surface of the moving powder. Mason followed, his bad leg a blur of agony and adrenaline. He wasn't running so much as he was falling with intent, trying to stay ahead of the primary wave. Below, the smugglers realized the trap too late. They tried to turn their machines, but the snowmobiles were heavy, their tracks spinning uselessly in the sudden surge of powder. Mason heard a scream, short, sharp, and cut off by the roar of the mountain. Two of the machines were swallowed instantly, disappearing beneath the white tide like toy boats in a storm. Mendez, however, was a veteran of the high country. He didn't try to turn. He pinned the throttle and drove straight toward a rock outcropping to the side. His machine leaped, airborne for a second, before slamming into the solid ground just as the edge of the avalanche swept past. Mason and Scout reached the safety of the treeline just as the tail end of the slide rumbled to a halt. The valley below was transformed, a smooth, featureless plain of packed white where the smugglers had been just seconds ago. The adrenaline that had kept Mason upright evaporated instantly. He hit the ground hard, his right leg finally giving up the ghost. A sickening pop echoed in the quiet air, and a white-hot spike of agony drove him into the snow. He tried to stand, but his leg was a useless, twisted weight. I'm finished, Scout, Mason wheezed, his face ashen. I'm done. Scout was beside him in a second, his tail wagging frantically, his muzzle nudging Mason's shoulder. He barked, a sharp, demanding sound. Go. Save yourself, buddy, Mason said, his eyes closing. You've done enough. You found me, you saved me from the rope, you pulled me from the river. You're free now. Go. Scout didn't go. Instead, he grabbed the thick fabric of Mason's tactical jacket and began to pull. The dog was small, but he possessed a ferocity of spirit that Mason had never seen. He growled, his paws digging into the snow, trying to drag 200 pounds of Ranger toward the distant treeline. You don't understand, Mason groaned. I can't move. Scout wouldn't relent. He nudged Mason's good leg, then went back to pulling the jacket. He circled Mason, barking, nipping at his sleeves, refusing to let the man succumb to the silence. It was a reversal of roles. The dog who had once needed a gentle hand was now the one providing the hard shove. Okay, Mason whispered, his hand finding Scout's head. I'll try. Using a fallen branch as a crutch and leaning heavily on Scout's back, Mason began to crawl/walk. It was an agonizing pace, maybe 100 yards every 10 minutes. His vision was swimming, the world turning into a series of disconnected snapshots. The white plain, the bleeding gums of the dog, the smell of pine. And then through the haze he saw it, a small dark shape tucked into a stand of ancient cedars. An abandoned ranger cabin, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow, its windows like sightless eyes. It was maybe 400 yards away. "There's Scout," Mason pointed. The cabin. But as they cleared the edge of the avalanche debris, a figure emerged from the treeline behind them. It was Mendez. He was on foot, his parka torn, his face a mask of cold fury. Two other men emerged behind him, battered and limping but armed. They had survived the edge of the slide, and they were no longer looking for a body. They were looking for vengeance. "Hail!" Mendez roared, the sound echoing off the rock walls. Mason didn't look back. He couldn't. He channeled every remaining ounce of his ranger training, every memory of Danny, every bit of Scout's stubbornness into his movements. He lurched toward the cabin, his bad leg dragging a bloody furrow in the snow. They reached the porch just as a bullet punched a hole in the rotted wood beside Mason's head. Crack. Inside. Mason shoved Scout through the door and tumbled in after him. He slammed the door and threw the heavy iron bolt. It was a sturdy cabin built of thick-hewn logs, but it was old. He dragged a heavy, dust-covered table across the door, then a rusted wood-burning stove. Crack, crack, crack. Bullets began to splinter the logs, whistling through the gaps in the chinking. Mason crawled across the floor, his fingers searching for anything he could use. He found an old Ranger radio in the corner. He flicked the switch, but it was dead, the batteries long since turned to acid. Scout was standing at the door, his hackles raised, a low, constant growl vibrating in his throat. He wasn't the timid dog who had failed the bite work at the academy. He was a protector. He was a partner. Mason found what he was looking for in a locker near the back. A heavy fire axe, its head rusted but its edge still formidable. He gripped it, his knuckles white. "This is it, boy," Mason said, looking at Scout. "Our last stand." Outside, the engines had been replaced by the sound of boots on the porch. The world grew very quiet. "Come out, Ranger." Mendez's voice was right outside the door. "Make it easy on yourself. You're trapped in a box. There's nowhere left to run." Mason looked at Scout. The dog was standing tall, his flopped ear twitching, his eyes fixed on the door with a fearless, unwavering focus. He looked like the champion he was born to be. Mason tightened his grip on the axe and leaned his back against the barricade. "Come in and find out what a ranger does when he's cornered, Mendez," he roared back. "And bring your friends. I've got a dog in here that's been waiting for a chance to show you what he's made of." Scout unleashed a thunderous, lung-filling bark, a sound of pure, unadulterated defiance that seemed to shake the very dust from the rafters. The weakest dog was gone. What remained was a warrior. But as the first heavy blow struck the door, splintering the aged wood, Mason noticed something Mendez had missed. A faint, rhythmic thumping was coming from the floorboards beneath the cabin, a hollow, metallic sound that shouldn't have been there. Chapter 8. The Stand. The interior of the abandoned ranger cabin was a cathedral of dust and rot, illuminated only by the fractured gray light of the dying afternoon. It smelled of ancient sawdust, cedar sap, and the metallic, cold scent of the storm that was still trying to claw its way through the chinking. Sergeant Mason Hale sat with his back against the front door, his right leg stretched out before him like a dead branch. The pain had moved beyond a sharp ache. It was now a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to harmonize with the howling wind. He gripped the handle of the fire axe he'd found in the locker, the wood rough and reassuring against his palms. Beside him, Scout was a statue of focused energy. The dog's ears were forward, his body coiled like a spring, a low, constant vibration humming in his chest that wasn't a growl so much as it was the sound of a predator reaching operating temperature. Outside, the crunch of boots on the frozen porch boards was unmistakable. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. They had the cabin surrounded, and they knew their prey was cornered. "Last chance, hermano?" Mendez's voice drifted through the splintered wood, sounding unervingly calm. "You're in a wooden box. We have the heat, we have the hardware, and we have all the time in the world. Throw the rifle out. Throw the axe out. We'll make it quick. A soldier's end. You don't want to burn in there, Mason. Think of the dog." Mason looked at Scout. The weakest dog of the litter was looking back at him, his amber eyes bright with an intelligence that seemed to see right through the fear and the exhaustion. Scout wasn't asking for a way out. He was waiting for the signal to engage. Mason felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in years. Not adrenaline, but a clean, cold clarity of purpose. He wasn't just a man waiting to die anymore. He was a ranger protecting his teammate. "You want the axe, Mendez?" Mason called out, his voice cracking but firm. "Come and get it." Mason didn't wait for a reply. He shifted his weight, his bad leg screaming in protest, and used his good arm to heave the fire axe. He didn't swing it at the door. He hurled it through the small, glassless window frame toward the sound of Mendez's voice. The heavy steel head shattered the remaining shards of glass and sailed into the wideout. It didn't hit anything but the porch railing, but the message was a thunderclap. The silence that followed was brief and deadly. "Fine," Mendez hissed. "Break it down." The back door of the cabin, rotted by decades of mountain moisture, didn't stand a chance. A heavy boot slammed into the center panel, and the wood shrieked as it gave way. A smuggler, a thick-necked man with a facial scar, stepped into the shadows, his carbine leveled. He never had a chance to find a target. Scout launched himself. It wasn't the tentative, uncertain pounce of the training academy. It was a kinetic strike, a 60-pound bolt of tan and black fury. Scout didn't go for the throat. His smaller size made that a secondary option. Instead, he went for the gun arm, his jaws locking onto the man's forearm with a crushing force that sent the carbine clattering to the floorboards. The man screamed, a high-pitched sound of shock and pain. Mason, ignoring the agony in his thigh, used the table he was leaning against to propel himself forward. He tackled the man with the weight of a falling tree, his shoulder driving into the smuggler's solar plexus. They hit the floor in a cloud of dust. Mason's hand found the man's throat, his ranger training taking over, his movements mechanical and brutal. He didn't need a leg to finish this. He only needed the rage. But before Mason could secure the man, the front window shattered. A second smuggler leaned through the frame, a suppressed pistol coughing twice. Scout let out a sharp, agonized yelp. He spun in the air, a spray of red darkening his tan coat as a bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing a furrow through the muscle. The dog hit the floor, skidding across the boards. "Scout!" Mason roared. The smuggler was repositioning for a kill shot. Mason's world began to tunnel. The smell of the cabin vanished, replaced by the scent of dust and burning oil. He saw Danny. He saw his brother lying in the dirt, the life leaking out of him while Mason was pinned down by a wall of lead. "Don't let them win, brother," Danny's voice echoed, not as a whisper but as a command. "Get up. Get up." The fury that erupted in Mason's chest was nuclear. He ignored the man beneath him and lunged for the fallen carbine on the floor. His bad leg buckled, his hip popping with a sickening wet sound, but he didn't stop. He dragged himself across the boards like a wounded wolf. Scout, despite the blood blooming on his shoulder, didn't retreat. He didn't freeze. The freezer was dead. He scrambled to his feet, his teeth bared in a snarl that was purely ancestral. He launched himself at the window, his claws raking the smuggler's face just as the man pulled the trigger again. The shot went wide, punching a hole in the ceiling. Mason reached the carbine. He rolled onto his back, the weapon heavy and cold in his hands. He didn't hesitate. He centered the sights on the man in the window and fired a single, controlled burst. The smuggler vanished from the frame, falling back into the snow. The cabin went silent again, save for the heavy, ragged breathing of the man and the dog. Scout limped back to Mason, his shoulder dripping, his ears flat against his head. He licked Mason's hand, a quick, frantic gesture of reassurance. "You're okay, boy," Mason wheezed, his fingers trembling as he touched the dog's wound. "You're okay. Just a graze. Just a scratch." The front door, the one Mason had been leaning against, suddenly buckled. The barricade of the old stove shifted. Carlos Mendez stepped into the cabin. He didn't come in fast. He came in with the terrifying confidence of a man who knew the game was over. He held a high-end tactical pistol, the barrel pointed directly at Mason's chest. He looked at the bodies of his men, then at the broken soldier on the floor. "Impressive," Mendez said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Truly. You're like an old dog that just doesn't know it's dead yet. But it's finished, Mason. You're out of ammo, out of legs, and out of luck." Mendez raised the pistol, his eye narrowing as he aligned the sights. "You should have died on that rope. It would have been more poetic." Scout moved. He didn't attack immediately. He stepped in front of Mason, his small frame shielding the man's vital organs. He stood there, his front paws planted, his head low. He was bleeding, he was limping, and he was outnumbered. Mendez laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "The little dog. Still think you're big enough, Scout? Still think you're a hero?" Scout didn't bark. He didn't whine. He simply growled, a low, tectonic vibration that seemed to come from the mountain itself. There was no fear in his amber eyes. There was only a cold, predatory assessment. Mendez's finger tightened on the trigger. Crack. Mendez fired, but in that millisecond Scout moved. His smaller size, the very weakness that had gotten him rejected from the academy, became his ultimate tactical advantage. He was a smaller target, faster and more agile than any standard shepherd. He dodged the bullet by a hair's breadth and lunged. He didn't go for the arm this time. He went for the thigh, his teeth locking onto Mendez's femoral region with the desperation of a creature fighting for its soul. Mendez roared in pain, his shot going wild, hitting the heavy wooden table. He tried to shake the dog off, slamming his fist into Scout's ribs, but Scout was a burr. He was an anchor. He held on, his jaws grinding into the muscle. Mendez stumbled back, his balance gone. As he fell against the wall, his pistol slipped from his hand, clattering across the floorboards toward Mason. Mason didn't think. He didn't feel the pain in his leg. He reached out, his fingers closing around the grip of the pistol. He leveled it at Mendez's chest just as the smuggler managed to kick Scout away. "Stay down." Mason roared, the sound echoing like a grenade in the small room. Mendez froze, his hand clutching his mangled thigh, his face pale with shock and blood loss. Scout was back on his feet instantly, his shoulder bleeding, standing between Mason and the smuggler, his eyes fixed on Mendez's throat. The standoff was absolute. The silence of the mountain rushed back in, heavy and suffocating. "Call off your men, Mendez," Mason panted, his finger resting on the trigger. "Now." Mendez looked at the gun, then at the dog, then at the man who looked like he had crawled out of a grave. He let out a ragged laugh. "Or what? You'll shoot? You're the good guys, remember? You're a ranger. You follow the rules. You take prisoners." Mason looked at the dog tags hanging from his neck. He thought about the 3 years of silence. He thought about the men he'd left in the dirt. He looked at Scout, the failure who had saved his life 3 times over. "I was a good guy," Mason said, his voice like grinding stone. "Now I'm just a man with nothing to lose and a dog who won't let me die. Don't test me, Carlos. I'm already a ghost." The tension in the room was a physical weight, a thin wire stretched to the breaking point. Mason's finger began to take up the slack on the trigger. He was ready to end it. He was ready to let the darkness have them both. And then the air began to vibrate. It wasn't a roar or a growl. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thrum 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 that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. It grew louder, a deep-chested pulse that drowned out the wind. Mendez's eyes widened. "What?" Mason's lips pulled back into a grim, bloody smile. "The emergency beacon. I activated the manual override on my gear when the avalanche hit. It's an old-school signal, Mendez. Low frequency. It takes a while to track, but once they find the ping." A blinding, artificial sun erupted outside the cabin windows. A powerful searchlight cut through the blowing snow, turning the interior into a stark, high-contrast landscape of white and black. The roar of the helicopter rotors was deafening now, the downdraft screaming through the holes in the roof. "Federal agents. Drop your weapons and put your hands in the air." A voice boomed from a loudspeaker, sounding like the voice of God. Mendez looked at the door, his eyes darting toward the back exit. He made a desperate, lunging move to flee. Scout didn't let him. The dog launched himself at Mendez's ankles, his small body a perfect tripwire. Mendez went down hard, his face slamming into the floorboards. "Stay down," Mason whispered, the pistol still steady. The front door was kicked open, not by a smuggler, but by a team of men in tactical gear with FBI and U.S. Marshals emblazoned on their chests. They swarmed the room, their weapon lights dancing through the dust. "Clear. We have one suspect down. One witness secured." A paramedic in a flight suit rushed toward Mason, his medical bag already open. "Sir, I'm with search and rescue. You're in bad shape. We need to get you on the bird immediately. You're severely hypothermic and that leg." Mason didn't look at the paramedic. He looked at Scout. The dog had finally collapsed, his strength spent, his tan fur matted with blood from the bullet graze and the fight. He was breathing in shallow, rapid pants, his amber eyes beginning to glaze over. "The dog first," Mason said, his voice a rasping command. "Sir, you have a compound fracture and—" "I said the dog first." Mason's hand shot out, grabbing the paramedic's sleeve. "He took a bullet for me. He saved my life on the rope. He pulled me out of the river. You save the dog or I'm not moving." The paramedic looked at the dog, then at the intensity in the ranger's eyes. He nodded slowly. "Copy that. We'll stabilize him. Ben, get the K9 kit. We've got a hero here." Mason watched as they lifted Scout onto a specialized stretcher. He saw the dog's tail give a single weak wag as the medic applied a pressure bandage to his shoulder. Only then did Mason let the medics lift him. As they were carried out of the cabin and toward the idling Black Hawk helicopter, the mountain was illuminated by a dozen spotlights. The smugglers were being led away in zip ties, their invincible operation dismantled in the snow. The helicopter began to lift off, the ground falling away. Mason looked through the open side door. He saw the White Grave avalanche chute, the frozen river, and the gnarled pine tree where he had hung upside down, waiting for the end. He saw the mountain that had tried to kill him, but he also saw the crucible that had forged him into something new. The cabin grew smaller, a tiny speck of rot in a vast, white wilderness. The interior of the helicopter was a world of green light and the smell of ozone. A medic was working on Scout in the corner, checking his vitals. "He's going to make it," the medic shouted over the roar of the rotors. "The bullet just took some meat. He's exhausted and he's got some dental trauma from whatever he was chewing on, but he's a fighter." "What's his name?" Mason looked at the dog. Scout was looking back at him, those wise, intelligent eyes finally peaceful. He wasn't the weakest shepherd anymore. He was the one who had seen the path through the storm. "Scout," Mason said, the word feeling right in his throat. "His name is Scout. Because he found me when no one else would. Because he showed me the way back." As the helicopter banked toward the lights of the city in the distance, Mason felt the weight of 3 years of guilt finally beginning to lift. He wasn't broken equipment. He was a partner. He reached out his hand and Scout rested his chin on Mason's palm. The smuggling operation was gone. The evidence was secured. But as the morphine the paramedic had injected began to cloud Mason's vision, he saw the lead federal agent looking at Scout's ear, the one that still flopped over, and then at a file on a tablet. The agent's expression shifted from professional to concerned. He leaned toward the medic and whispered something that Mason couldn't hear over the engine, but the look on the agent's face made the hair on Mason's neck stand up. The mountain had been conquered, but as they flew toward safety, Mason realized that the failed working dog with a champion bloodline carried a secret that the government wasn't ready to let go of, and the real fight for Scout's life was only just beginning. The hospital room in Seattle was a world of sterile whiteness, a sharp, artificial contrast to the bone-deep purity of the Cascade snow. It smelled of industrial floor wax, ozone, and the faint underlying scent of antiseptic, a smell that Sergeant Mason Hale had associated with failure for the better part of 3 years. He lay in the adjustable bed, his right leg encased in a heavy, pristine cast that felt like a localized prison. The titanium pins had been reset, the bones stabilized, but the doctors had been cautious. They spoke of limited mobility and long-term physical therapy, words that usually signaled the end of a soldier's utility. On the wall-mounted television, a local news anchor was speaking over a grainy aerial shot of the North Basin. Federal authorities have confirmed the dismantling of a multi-state drug smuggling operation. The bust, which resulted in the seizure of over $50 million in narcotics, was made possible by the harrowing testimony and evidence provided by a local wilderness instructor and former Army Ranger. Mason reached for the remote and clicked the screen into blackness. He didn't want to hear about the hero in the cabin. He didn't care about the commendations the Forest Service was already preparing. His mind was miles away, trapped in a different kind of silence. Every time he closed his eyes, he didn't see the news report. He saw a small, bedraggled dog with one flopped ear, shivering in a helicopter and looking at him with eyes that had seen the very edge of the world. A soft knock at the door preceded Sarah, the VA counselor Mason had spent months avoiding. She didn't come in with her usual clipboard of assessments. She looked tired, her expression hovering somewhere between relief and a profound, heavy-hearted concern. "The doctors say you're ahead of schedule on the rewarming recovery," she said, pulling up a plastic chair. "Your heart is strong, Mason. They're calling it a miracle." "I don't believe in miracles," Mason rasped, his voice still sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. "I believe in debt." "Where is he, Sarah?" Sarah looked down at her hands. "The dog? He was treated at the emergency veterinary clinic in Everett. They stabilized the shoulder wound and treated the exposure. But Mason, because he's a washout from a registered working program and has no official owner of record, he's been transferred to the county animal shelter's holding facility." Mason's hand tightened on the bed rail, the metal creaking under his grip. "He's in a kennel? After what he did?" "It's protocol," she said softly. "The K-9 Academy he came from officially discarded him as a liability. According to their records, he has behavioral issues. Timidity, freezing under pressure, lack of drive. They don't want the liability of a failed dog being out in the public if he's prone to trauma. The shelter has him marked as unadoptable for working purposes. And given his history, they're worried he's too damaged to be a pet. They're not putting him down, Mason said. It wasn't a question. It was a threat. The counselor in me has to tell you to focus on your own recovery, Sarah countered, her voice firming. You have PTSD, a shattered leg, and a pending federal investigation. Taking on a high-needs, defective, working dog isn't exactly the prescription for a man trying to find stability. Defective. Mason's eyes flashed with a cold, ranger green fire. That dog stood down a mountain lion. He chewed through a 100-weight nylon rope with bleeding gums. He pulled me out of a frozen river when I was already dead and buried under the ice. He didn't freeze when it mattered. He did what no perfect dog could do. He leaned forward, ignoring the spike of pain in his hip. I don't care about the protocol and I don't care about the liability. That dog has more courage in his flopped ear than anyone I've ever served with. He's not a line item. He's my partner. Get me the paperwork. Mason, the shelter is already overwhelmed. They see dogs like Scout every day, the ones that don't fit the mold. They think they're doing the humane thing by get me the paperwork, Mason repeated, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. If I have to crawl to that shelter on one leg and take him back, I will. Tell them the ranger who just busted a $50 million drug ring is making his first and only request. The legal battle took 4 days of grueling bureaucratic warfare. Mason fought the adoption red tape from his hospital bed, using his military record, his recent service to the Department of Justice, and a sheer, relentless stubbornness that eventually wore the county officials down. They called him unstable, they called the dog unpredictable, but eventually the sheer weight of the story, the man and the dog who had rescued each other, became a PR nightmare they couldn't ignore. The day he was discharged, Mason didn't go back to his cabin. He took a cab straight to the King County Animal Shelter. He was on crutches, his movements slow and pained, but his eyes were fixed on the cinder-block building at the end of the lot. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of bleach and the desperate, cacophonous barking of 100 lonely souls. It was a place of high anxiety, a place for the unwanted. A shelter worker led Mason to the very back, to the behavioral observation wing where the quiet ones were kept. He hasn't been doing well, the worker whispered, her voice tinged with pity. He won't eat much. He just sits in the corner and watches the door. He doesn't bark at the other dogs. It's like he's just given up. They reached Kennel 42. Scout was there, a small, huddled shape of tan and black fur pressed against the back corner of the concrete run. His shoulder was shaved and stitched, a stark reminder of the bullet he'd taken. His one ear was flopped lower than usual, and he didn't even look up when the gate rattled. He looked like a dog who was waiting for the end of a story he never asked to be in. Mason leaned his crutches against the wire mesh and slowly, painfully, lowered himself to his good knee. "Hey, buddy," he whispered. "Miss me?" The transformation was instantaneous. It wasn't a sudden explosion of movement, but a slow, electric awakening. Scout's head snapped up. His amber eyes locked onto Mason's face, and for a heartbeat, time seemed to freeze again. Then, his tail began to wag, not a happy, playful wag, but a frantic, desperate thumping against the concrete. He lunged forward, pressing his body against the chain-link fence, whimpering a sound of such profound relief that it made the shelter worker turn away to wipe her eyes. "He's been depressed since arrival," the worker said, her voice shaking. "We thought it was the trauma." "It wasn't the trauma," Mason said, reaching through the wire to bury his hand in Scout's fur. "He just thought he was back to being alone. He thought he'd failed again." Mason pulled the dog close, feeling the rhythmic, vibrating heat of Scout's body. "Not happening, Scout. You and me, we're a team now. And a team doesn't leave its own behind." The homecoming at the cabin was a quiet affair. The mountain was still covered in a thick blanket of late winter snow, but the air had lost its lethal edge. Mason hobbled inside, Scout trotting beside him, his nose working overtime to catalog the smells of his new life. The dog explored every corner with a curious, cautious dignity, eventually finding a plush bed Mason had placed near the wood-burning stove, the same stove they had used as a barricade in the ranger cabin. Scout circled the bed 3 times and then curled into a tight ball, letting out a long, shuddering sigh of contentment. He was finally safe. He was finally home. Mason sat in his old armchair watching the dog sleep. He looked at the dog tags hanging from the lamp, Danny's tags, and for the first time the sight didn't bring a crushing weight of guilt. It brought a sense of continuity. "You taught me something, Scout," Mason whispered into the flickering firelight. "I spent 3 years thinking I was broken because I survived when others didn't. I thought my weakness was that I couldn't forget. But you showed me that being small doesn't mean being weak. Being afraid doesn't mean being a coward. Real strength isn't about not having scars. It's about doing the job anyway, even when the world tells you you're not enough." The weeks that followed were a montage of mutual healing. Mason's physical therapy was grueling, but he wasn't doing it alone. Every time he struggled to complete a set of leg lifts or staggered during a walk down the driveway, Scout was there, a constant, furry pacer who nudged him forward. When the night terrors came, the sounds of the Kuhner ambush or the creaking of the rope, Mason would find a warm, wet nose pressing against his hand, pulling him back to the present. As spring began to thaw the higher elevations, Mason started taking Scout to his appointments at the VA. At first, the other veterans looked at the two small German shepherd with curiosity. He didn't look like the massive, intimidating service dogs they were used to seeing. He looked like a reject. "That a service dog?" one older vet asked, a man with an empty sleeve and eyes that had seen too much of the Mekong Delta. "He looks a bit small for the work." "He's the best I've ever seen," Mason replied, his hand resting on Scout's head. "He saved my life in the North Basin. He doesn't need to be big to be strong." Mason watched as the vet reached out a trembling hand and Scout, with an uncanny intuition, leaned his head into the man's palm. He didn't jump or bark. He simply offered his presence, his sensitive soul, acting as a lightning rod for the man's unspoken pain. In that moment, an idea began to take root in Mason's mind. He realized that there were hundreds of failed working dogs in shelters, dogs deemed too soft, too anxious, or too small for the violence of police or military work. And there were thousands of veterans who felt exactly the same way, men and women who had been discarded by the system because they no longer fit the standard. Within 6 months, Second Chance K9S was born. Using the reward money from the smuggling bust and his own savings, Mason converted his property into a training sanctuary. It wasn't a standard academy. They didn't train for bite work or aggression. They trained for empathy, for detection of panic attacks, and for the kind of fierce, unwavering loyalty that only the discarded truly understand. Scout became the lead trainer's assistant. He would walk among the new recruits, both the dogs and the veterans, offering a calm, stabilizing energy. He was a living testament to the fact that a label given by an expert is often the least accurate thing about a living soul. The program caught the attention of the media. A national news feature titled, "The Rejected Hero," told the story of the Ranger and the Washout. One segment featured an interview with Vance, the original trainer from the K9 facility in Idaho who had failed Scout 18 months earlier. Vance looked into the camera, his gravelly face uncharacteristically soft. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice rough. "In this business we measure bite force and drive. We measure how a dog handles a gun. But we don't have a way to measure the size of a heart. Scout taught us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. I measured the wrong things and because of that I almost lost the best dog I ever saw." The final scene of the season of their lives took place on a crisp morning in early autumn. The Cascades were a riot of gold and crimson, the air tasting of pine and the first hint of winter. Mason was hiking the trail toward the North Basin. He walked with a steady, confident gait, his limp almost entirely gone. He didn't need the crutch or the branch anymore. Scout led the way, his one ear still flopped over, moving with a confidence that radiated from every fiber of his being. He wasn't looking for danger. He was simply enjoying the journey. They reached the cliff edge, the place where the gnarled pine tree still stood, its branch scarred where the rope had once been. Mason stopped and placed a hand on the bark. He looked down into the gorge, which was now a lush, green valley instead of a white abyss. "Thank you, Scout," Mason said softly, "for not running away that day." Scout sat beside him, leaning his weight against Mason's leg, his amber eyes watching the horizon. He let out a low, contented huff. "They called you the weakest," Mason said, looking down at his partner. "But you were exactly strong enough to save the man who had given up. I think Danny would have liked you." He looked up at the sky, and for the first time in years the sky didn't look like a place for mortars or flares. It just looked like home. Sometimes God's greatest gifts come in the smallest packages, wearing labels the world gave them but that couldn't define them. If this story moved you, share it with someone who's been told they're not enough. Subscribe to see more stories of unlikely heroes. And remember, weakness is just strength that hasn't been tested yet. Mason turned to head back down the trail, but Scout stopped. The dog's ears suddenly snapped forward, and he let out a low, inquisitive whine. He wasn't looking at the trail. He was looking at a dark, unmarked black SUV parked at the trailhead far below, a vehicle that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. As Mason squinted through his binoculars, he saw a man in a dark suit step out, holding a tablet and looking directly up at their position. The man wasn't a forest ranger and he wasn't a hiker. He was the same agent who had whispered in the helicopter 6 months ago. The mystery of Scout's bloodline was no longer a secret, and as the government shadow lengthened over the mountain, Mason realized that the second chance they had fought for was about to be challenged by a past that Scout's original trainers were desperate to reclaim. What did they find in Scout's blood that makes him the most valuable asset in the country? We almost lost Scout because experts decided he was failed equipment. We almost lost Mason because he believed he was broken. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, if you've ever felt like a failure in a world that only rewards the strong, then this story is for you. But stories like this only survive if you help them breathe. Liking this video is a vote for the underdog. Subscribing ensures that another failed dog gets a seat on that rescue helicopter. Comment the word loyalty if you would have stayed on that mountain with them. Don't leave them behind again.